And David Solomon with Dimitri Zahoudis, considering another important question, is David foretold us. The question is, and should be, what is love?
What is love?
What is love? Do we understand love in the age of the subject? And can there be love within a subjective universe? Are we all not too selfish to consider love?
I would have thought that the question is the opposite. I would have thought that love is only possible in a subjective universe, given that love is love is impossible without the subject, just as love is impossible without an object. Once you have an object, of necessity you have a subject, otherwise you wouldn't have an object. There's no such thing as a purely objective universe, just as there's no such thing as a purely objective point of view. There's no such thing as a purely objective anything. The minute you objectify, the minute you say there is an object, there is a subject that must be positing that.
And
it would be like saying that there is left without right. There is up without down. The minute you posit up, of necessity is a down.
No, but I was being sensational in assuming that as we're spending so much on the subject, there is little time
You've
to
spent your life being sensational.
But,
I think we need to break out of the dichotomy of subject-object.
All right, let's start
in relation
again.
to love. Because no, that's not a trivial comment. I think we need to break out of the paradigm of subject-object in relation to love. That has been the trap into which Western discourse has fallen since there was an East and a West. Yeah?
So let us start again.
So we need to realize that love... yeah, go on, let's start again.
What is love?
Well, there's a nice aspect in the Kabbalistic tradition. The numerical value of the word for love in the Hebrew language, and as you know, there are very few sacred power languages left from the ancient world. One of them is Hebrew, one of them is Sanskrit. The numerical value of the word for love, if I said to you, what do you think is going to be the numerical value of the word for love, what would you say?
11.
No, but interesting you said that. Interesting you said that. 13. 13. Right? The numerical value of the name of God is 26. So love is a factor of the divine. It is almost like half the divine, if you like.
Profound.
Yeah, very profound actually. The word for one, O-N-E, one, is echad. The numerical value of echad
is 13.
Is 13. So people go, how can, if God is one, how can it be twice the numerical value of 1. How can you have 26? The divine name is 26, and it's twice the numerical value of the word for 1, is because the other complementarity of that is the word ahava, meaning love, which is also 13. So there are two aspects to the divine. There's the oneness of the divine, which is the divine in itself, the oneness of the divine, the unity of all creation. As a corollary of that, love is the other aspect of the divine, which is the engagement with reality. So all is one and all is love. And if you focus on just the unity of God without realizing the processual love of the divine interaction with the world, then you're going to miss the point. If you just focus on the love without realizing the unity of all things in the divine, you're going to miss the point. You need both of them in a very, very simple kind of way.
And how can we bring that moving analogy into our elementary existence? You know, the unity of the divine is unimaginable from the minds.
So look, love. Yeah, love is obviously a concept that has been to some extent compromised, debased, exploited, and as many thinkers have shown already in the realm of human affairs, because divine love is a tricky business. But if we deal with the realm of human affairs, then there are different types of love that have been identified, right? Remember, over 30 years ago, I read a book by a guy. It would be known to some people watching this. There was a guy called Eric Fromm, and he wrote a book on the different types of love. And I remember thinking that love is not something that you can do some kind of Aristotelian
dissection
and categorization.
Yes.
But he has there a few different types of love. You know, the love of friends, the love of husband and wife, the love of parent and child, the love of the lover. You know, it's all the rest of it. So, but if we try and distill what love is, we can get very suspicious.
Yes.
Because we can start to talk about hormonal and chemical reactions to things. We can look at love as being simply a label that we place on biological drives. Yeah.
And as we're considering this, my mind has gone into panic, because either before or after that, Erich Fromm gave us the anatomy of human destructiveness. And I say, if
but
this
that's no need to panic.
No need to panic.
If you want things to panic about, I'll give you things to panic about, but you don't have to panic about that. The really interesting thing is when we try and work out the distinction between conditional and non-conditional love, right?
Yes.
Let's say we take something banal, like I love ice cream.
Yes.
Right? You know, we talk about only the divine has conditional love, right? But my love of ice cream, for example, right,
Is an absolute.
yeah, it's not conditional. It's not conditional whether the ice cream loves me, right? It might be conditional on how I'm feeling. It's very easy to get trivial and banal when talking
Yes.
about love, but that's how the word is. The same word is used in English. I love ice cream. I love bananas, right? I love the cricket. I love watching sport in
Yes.
my underwear, right?
Considering my linguistic,
And the love that the divine has for the universe, the love that is the key to hope and survival of the human race, the love, all the great lofty ideas about love that we've been looking at since the symposium, and right up until, you know, some dude is watching the football in his underwear and he loves it. And the same word is having to suffice for everything, is it not? So here really we have hit a linguistic impasse, I think.
Would it be easier for us to be able to love in other languages? Because if language relates us to our environment and vice versa, then are we not restrained in the way we understand love in English?
Yeah, but you know, it's that's interesting. Because now I'm thinking that maybe if we had all these different types of words, it would become very cumbersome. Maybe this, and people would rebel against the higher forms of love. They would rebel against the higher forms of love, precisely because language makes demands, and having just the one word that applies to all situations that you that compel you or entice you to invest your time and energy in. You say, for example, someone works very hard because they either love the work or they love the money or they love the outcome. There's always a telos to what they're doing that is driven by agape in some form. And maybe I'd have to think about that, whether or not perhaps we would be more adequate if we loved in other languages. Is there a language you can think of that is giving us several different types of love?
I can relate to the Greek saying, you cannot say that I love cricket in the same way that you can say...
How would you say I love cricket? Mo aresi?
Yes, which is like, you cannot say...
Yeah, no, but what if you want? But what if you really want to be emphatic and intensive about that?
You can say that cricket drives me crazy.
Okay.
Because...
Okay, let's unpack that for a bit. Let's unpack that for a bit. So maybe in the Hellenic continuum, such as it is in Katharevus, but any love that is impure, no, it's not the great lofty philosophical reified metaphysical love, but simply I love watching the soccer in my underpants, right, is actually a form of craziness.
And I'm thinking as you're speaking that the same term, driving crazy, can be used comfortably in a sexual interaction. You can describe the sexual love as craziness.
What is lust?
Lust is not a term that you would use.
It's very Teutonic.
It is very Teutonic.
You know,
the Greeks, I do not know that they would use the term lust.
That's interesting. We have to investigate that because, you know, when look, I've always been impressed, right? People talk about the great Platonic idea of love that Plato speaks about, you know, in the Symposium and the boom, and the whole idea of the two halves coming together as the whole, the masculine and the feminine. They have this amazing discourse on love, and then at the end of it, but that part is, you know, you can take that or leave that. Anyone can sit down at night and compose theories about love, but the really impressive part about it is that when the discussion is all had and everybody has been drinking their 4 or 5 flagons of wine and they're all sprawled out there and like You can imagine the scene, right? And only Socrates is left standing, right? But he doesn't go, it's day or it's the next day, but he doesn't go home to sleep. Then he goes to the bathhouse with his young boy. It's almost ridiculous. It's almost like saying at the end of all of this immensely important and foundational philosophical discussion of love, the discussion that is going to form the concepts of love that are going to become the pillars of Western thought's perspectives on metaphysical love, at the end of all that, he just goes to the bathhouse with a young boy. It's astonishing, and I think it's something ironic, deliberately ironic about it. Deliberately ironic. You see, unlike others, I actually accord even the Greeks with a sense of humour.
Even the Greeks?
Well, I'm being harsh. I mean, when I say the Greeks, I don't mean Greek culture. I mean, you know, the first thing that comes to mind when you read Plato, when you hear about Plato, you discuss Plato, is not his sense of humour.
Oh, correct.
You don't say people go, Plato, he's a funny bastard. Right? You don't like, it's not. But I regard that as kind of interesting. I believe it's a deliberate irony. I believe it is an undermining of our attempts to philosophize love. Obviously, there are those who will watch us discussing this and going, he doesn't know, what does he know, what does he understand, whatever. But at the same time, I'm fully aware, that eros is a dimension of love, as you brought up, right? But I think that we are too advanced now in our dissection of perversions to really believe in some of the former theories regarding the uniting of souls and
the absolute. Yes. Having
and at the same time, I'm very, very suspicious of theological systems that attempt to construct entire programs based on love, because in the name of love they go about doing a lot of hate and a lot of violence, a lot of suffering, a lot of bloodshed, a lot of misery in the name of a God that is loving.
Yes.
A lot.
Yes.
A lot.
So, having reached the level of cerebral development, are we at the stage where love, as it has been understood through the ages, may be superseded?
Well, I think it needs to be refined, because many things that we thought were, or that we use the word love for, obviously are really fitting into other states of
Engagement.
I was going to say investment. Engagement. Very good. So we have to find out what it is that we can, but in saying that, what drives us to define it? We have a concept in our head. We have a concept that we want love to be. We have a concept that we want love to be. Why are we saying that love is not the man watching football in his underwear, but love is the great unconditional giving that a person has for a higher purpose? Okay, now we can start talking about love. Why is that one and not the other? What is it? What do we have in our mind, even beyond in the meta-linguistic realm? What are we trying to strive for here? And maybe there is a part of it that we want to elevate the things that we like. We want to imagine that they are existing on a much higher plane, and even beyond that, we take those ideas and we reify them, and we call them a divine.
Which brings us to an even more challenging conundrum.
What, polyamory?
No, because
because that is an issue. That is an issue. The whole concept of monogamy is an issue.
But isn't
And
monogamy?
those watching this in the future will know what I mean. It is.
But equally, monogamy is less work, so it should be the preferable option, at least for a break.
You think monogamy is less work?
Yes, polyamory.
Well, how is monogamy less work? Well, because you have less energy required in pursuit.
No, but you have less demands on.
Well, because with every new wife comes a new mother-in-law.
That's also a possibility.
I'm just saying, it's a construct, right?
It
Monogamy.
is a construct, yes.
And it's not a Judeo-Christian construct. Well, it might be a Christian construct. It's not a Judeo construct
Yes,
for men.
yes.
It's not. It's not Abrahamic in nature, and nor really in any other society outside the.
Christo-Western.
Yes, and therefore let's you unpack that and you realize that is because Christianity has, from very early on, staked its reputation on being a representation of the absolute, and they swallowed a big chunk. Don't you worry about it. Christianity swallowed a big chunk of Middle Platonism there, and a bit of shtickle Gnosticism, more than a shtickle. It got itself all wound up, thinking, every man is a woman, every woman is a man. Why? Because that's reflective of the primordial Adam and Eve, and therefore we are arriving back at a reflection of the true state of nature, so that, and also ultimately because, and perhaps even primarily because, as you know, and this is so banally known and obvious that I don't want people to think that I'm saying something innovative here. Everybody knows it. Every taxi driver in Melbourne could tell you this, or Thessaloniki could tell you that Christianity has an issue with sex.
Yes.
It has some serious hang-ups, because sex was seen as enjoyable, and that's a problem. That's a problem. Who said you're supposed to enjoy yourself? Where does it say you should enjoy yourself? Say with the early church fathers? Like, well, where was enjoying yourself part of the program here? We're dealing in absolutes. We've got to salvage your sorry ass from sin. Like, where's the space for you to enjoy yourself? And that was an innovation. That was a departure. Before that, really, in the pagan world, and even in the non-pagan world, the Judaic world, what's wrong with enjoying yourself? What, there's a problem with enjoying yourself. But therefore, so sex for the sake of the pleasure of engaging in eros as a form of love, and not merely and strictly in a disciplined way for procreation, was seen as problematic.
Although I know that there is certain authors in the first millennium of Christian discourse who supported sex for joy, but in a uniquely and exclusively monogamous domain.
Yeah, but everybody knows that is that's a project. That's not so easy to achieve. And it's not just Christianity. I mean, which brought in the concept of enjoyment. Judaism eventually went with monogamy. By the time you get, certainly for European Jewish communities, by the time you get to the 11th century, you're already in a monogamous world because they were living in mostly Christian communities. Polygamy continued in Islamic lands for Jewish communities right up until the 20th. So ultimately, we arrive in the Judeo-Christian continuum at the understanding that monogamy is the ideal state, and don't think that Christianity was the only discourse that was, gobbling down the middle Platonism and the Gnosticism. I mean, everybody was having a part of that. The big question now is, however, is that what drives contemporary monogamy in theological sense? And this is an issue currently in the Jewish world, which is breaking down some of the medieval structures. So people are talking about polygamy again. And what is the driving force now that is retaining monogamy is in fact contemporary gender relations. You're looking at me a little confused.
Yes.
And well, it's very, I'll explain it simply, and that is that if you start saying that men should be allowed to have more wives, then you need to come up with an argument as to why women can't have more husbands at the same time. And that's a little freaky for the for a world that still sees that still retains structures that are primarily patriarchal.
Yes.
And even within the active elements of feminism, within theological discourse, they're not ready for that, because men have always been more vociferous proponents of polygamy than women. That is not to say there are not women who would not think it a good and worthwhile idea, but on the whole, men have been more vocal in and invested in that idea. So gender relations are the new determinant of this, because as you break down structures, you then need to accommodate them to what is. And so it's very interesting, because the driving forces now, the driving forces of change within religious worlds are not what they used to be. They are different forces. And in fact, we will see, optimistically speaking, if we don't blow ourselves up, we will see a number of significant reformations happen right across the spectrum of Abrahamic religions. And of course that then gets tempered as well by the kind of standards that modern industrialized nation states want to bring to things, to tell people what they should and should not do, and they're very fond of doing that. And part of the reason they do that is because they don't want some guy saying, "Oh, how come you've got 4 wives and I've only got 1? Oh, and he's got none and he's got 3, right?" It complicates things, so they say everybody has 1 at a time, and then, but there's no fundamental reason why polyamory couldn't be the norm. There will be a very strong push towards it, I can tell you. If societies now are being far more permissible towards same-sex marriage, then the polyamorists and the polygamists have a much greater, but equally strong claim to say,
yes.
What's your problem with us?
Yes.
What's your problem with us? So what we seem to see is that the progression of human society, generally involves the eradication of illogicals. And without going into too many examples of that, we can see it, slavery is an anathema because we realize that it is, apart from anything else, fundamentally illogical. The illogicity of it lies in the realization that why should I be the master and you be the slave? This is, of course, putting Nietzsche aside, because he argued that that's precisely what where liberal society was heading, towards the eradication of that distinction, whereas that distinction was not social, it was in fact innate in the human condition. But there is something inside the human that strives towards the universal, away from the illogicity of the imposition of particulars upon the human condition. That's what ultimately has driven any social progress that we've made. That is what drives most of the ideologies, whether they were successful or not. I mean, Marxism, not Marxist thought, but Marxism is an example of a brutal attempt to impose a universalist idea. And in a way, even religious systems work on the same basis. They find a principle they believe to be universal, and based upon that, they can make distinctions between those who are closer to evincing the universal in their life. But of course, all religious systems, in order to do that, use a conveyance of particularisms, and then the particularisms begin to subjugate the universals, and this is where we go off track. But humanity strives towards universal principles, and that which we were talking about earlier in relation to the nuclear family, and in relation to what will eventually drive the discussion in human society about issues like monogamy and polygamy and so on, will be an attempt to articulate universal principles. If your universal principle is simply that consenting adults can be empowered to create the relations of love that they want, then you are inevitably going to go down that road, unless you find universals that can be justified. The only universal that society has been able to in some ways still articulate in relation to that domain is incest. I'm not seeing society any time in a hurry saying that a brother and sister can marry because they want to, although theoretically that argument is there, but I think they'll be able to.
But equally, would nature not interfere in that development?
Well, that's what they would argue. They would say, that's medically unwise, and therefore they would appeal to a universal aspect of biology, but they would just as equally be able to get around that. I'm not seeing even incestuous relationships being able to withstand the inexorable tide of the application of the universal and the eradication of illogicity. It's a fundamental aspect of the human condition. We strive towards universals because universals to us exemplify truth.
Is there a moment in our development that we may consider our next step as against nature?
If it belongs, we are not outside nature. How can something be? How can anything be against nature?
I don't know.
This in fact was, who argued that there's nothing against nature. Of course, and that's problematic because really, once you start discussing him, then you're on a whole different
horse
trajectory. But that's the fundamental tenet of Descartes.
Yes.
I mean, we are natural beings, so whatever we do is nature. There's nothing unnatural if I want to do it. If I have an impulse, nature gave me that impulse. It is against nature to deny myself that impulse. Read his Philosophie de la Boudoir, where he makes this case very, very clearly. One of the most brilliant libertine essays of the entire, period of the 18th and 19th century. Is like phenomenal, appalling.
Yes.
Because I innately feel that you would not be able to implement a society like that without causing suffering, if everybody can
Absolutely.
just follow their nature. So you need the concept of law, but law can be universal in its applications. You can't go around raping people and killing them just because you have an impulse to do so, because it infringes upon their impulses. And but once again, the application of the rule of law and individual rights and so on is a manifestation of the striving towards universality. That's what secularism is. That's what science is. And these are not things that are dangerous ideas that were invented by fat Enlightenment thinkers in cafes in Paris and Berlin in the 18th century. This is the striving of the human condition towards the universal. It's like we come out of it and we realize, it's like that's why the Enlightenment is the Enlightenment. It's because really that world that we got from the Middle Ages was a conjecture that simply became one great big stinky particularism. And we broke the shackles of it and said, well, why aren't we questioning this? Why, and that journey has not ended. We will continue on that journey. Now,
within that understanding, then there are no frontiers. Yes, there's no borders.
What do you mean by frontiers or borders?
If we accept the first part of the proposition, then incest may become
it's what I'm saying. Is that it will become harder and harder to defend against incest, and that is really where theological systems will be at the forefront, because they will argue that incest is wrong because divine revelation has indicated that incest is wrong, and it will be up to it will be the pressure will be then upon secular society to find a correlative. No one wants to legalize incest. No one wants to. Except maybe a few brothers and sisters out there, but no one wants to legalize.
But I'm sure 1,000 years ago nobody would have wanted to legalize gay marriage.
Precisely. And it took 1,000 years of the breakdown of religious control to get to the point we are now, where gay marriage is an issue that, in some countries is discussable and legitimate.
Yes.
And unless you look, I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty. There are sustainable reasons, even from a universalist secular perspective, that would mitigate against incest, taking into account the personality variables within the nuclear family. We want to ensure that people have the most nurturing and protective
Yes.
environment, and if you allow certain types of relationships, then you can open the door to abuse. It's a tenuous defense of the illegality of incest, but it is not dismissible.
It is legitimate, yes.
Yeah. But bearing in mind, as we spoke outside, and not on camera, but we spoke outside and we talked about the way in which various models of the nuclear family are broken down, and really that the the man, woman, children, monogamous nuclear family that we have seen emerge from the Judeo-Christian world of the last couple of millennia is really overall in all of human history is more the deviation rather than the norm. Yeah? And as I hope to have demonstrated, a consequence of the striving for universality.
It will be superseded, or it has been superseded.
Well, it may be that it's correct. I was arguing substantively. It could be that it is justifiable if you think universally. One man, one woman, children. It could be that you could say, well, it is a picture that most closely resembles the universal minimum
Yes.
for procreation.
Well,
And if we're not dealing with the minimums, everyone's allocated minimum, then we are going to be ultimately dealing with inequality.
yes.
If I have more than one wife at a time, that's a woman less for someone else. If a woman has more than one husband, that's a husband that's not going to be marrying another woman she's going to be without. So in the distribution of resources, it could be an idealistic position to work towards, and also because there may be something slightly illogical about the necessity for polygamous relationships. But those facets of it are not connected necessarily with the striving of universality
Yes.
in the legal social rights domain, which means we would have to go through an entire cycle of that before we would get to a picture of universality.
And what's love got to do with it?
Well, that's my point. Love is... love is really, it's the fictive and somewhat dramatic construct that we erect in order to facilitate a universal perspective on our relationships. It is not simply the case, human beings, when they get intellectual, they don't like to be reminded that they are fundamentally biological.
Yes. We are fundamentally
So
chemists,
rather
yes.
than say, this is the partner basically the best partner I could obtain with my resources and background and abilities.
And muscular presence.
And whatever, muscular or financial presence, whatever it is, right? This is the best possible partner that I could obtain given my context. We say, I love that person. I mean, I'm being very, very cynical, but I'm just trying to show you that all attempts to define love, what's love got to do with it?
All attempts to define love ultimately
Who was that?
are
Tina
inconclusive.
Turner, was that?
I don't know.
What's love got to do?
It may have been Tina Turner.
What's love but a second-hand emotion? What's love? It was a song from the 80s, right?
And you sang it so beautifully.
Thank you. What is love but a second-hand emotion? Yep, that's a philosophical statement right there. But I wanted to talk just briefly about the eradication of illogicities, and I wanted to talk about theological systems. There are a great many things that are obvious to us now about history that for some reason our ancestors didn't realize. Yeah?
Yes.
which stands to reason that there are a great many things about our current condition that our descendants will say, they didn't realize, right? Like, it's so obvious, but how could they not have realized it? Because we exist in a certain framework and we don't see it, right? We have fully subjectified ourselves and we are not seeing the object for what it is. And frankly, if there is anything that is clear, and I say this to you now so that the people in the future who come back to our age and steal my things, because I know who you are. You come back to this point in time and you steal my things and I can't find them, the people from the future. But I say to them so that they know that we had this realization now.
Yes.
Is that all of the great issues connected with what's currently called the clash of civilization, yeah?
Yes.
Which is the West versus Islam in a very
Yes.
reductive sense. Those issues cannot be solved politically.
Those issues.
Certainly not in an age where politicians fail to recognize the power of symbol. But even if they do, they cannot be solved politically. They will not be solved politically. They can only be solved theologically. They can only be solved theologically. It is not politicians who should be sitting down trying to work this out, because they have achieved nothing. And they will achieve nothing so long as your ayatollahs in Iran and your imams in Iraq and your religious leaders, whatever, and your professors in the University of Cairo and are not prepared to compromise with sharing the space of the planet with infidels like
You and I.
well, you and I are not even necessarily the big infidels. You and I are dhimmi.
Yes.
The Jews and Christians are at least got some kind of tenuous situation, but really that's where the acute part of it is. They're not worried about the godless pagans. That actually the issue is really to do with whether or not there is a space on the planet for people who do not accept their absolutist point of view, and that compromise has to be made theologically. It could be political from their perspective, but it has to be done with theologians. They will not let it go. They are the ones who are constantly feeding the machine.
Yes.
And I'll tell you who else is feeding the machine, and why you will never achieve what you want to achieve unless you address this. Yeah? And you never hear it talked about. Yeah? How is it possible now? And people will look at this and go, "Oh, he's naive," and he doesn't know. No. How is it possible that 15-year-olds in Africa, right, are walking around in these bands of frenzied whatever? And Africa is just one example, wherever they are, right? And they've got guns. Where do the guns come from? And I'm not saying who gives it to them.
No.
Who makes them?
Yes.
Who makes them?
Yes.
This is not to be interpreted. What I'm saying is not to be interpreted as connected with the whole issue of the rights of the Second Amendment in the American Constitution, which is a tangential but not identical
not,
issue.
not for this purpose.
No, not for this purpose. That's a whole other thing. I'm talking about the propagation, the irresponsible propagation of weapons in conflict areas. I mean, how does that happen and no one says anything? I don't understand it. I don't understand how. I don't understand. And but at the end of the day, the problems. We still live in the theological age.
Yes.
And the age of ideas and the age of theological ideas, we are still in it. We have not attained escape velocity from that yet, and because even the secular world is still dealing in the currency of illogicals in many ways, and therefore ultimately, and this is the part that causes people to clench their sphincters and they can't handle. But ultimately, the whole concept of the nation state will dissolve. And I imagine that we will probably have to go through some awful period of tyrannical world government before we eventually break that down into a syndicalized anarchism. But hopefully by that time we will have arrived at, the Star Trek universe.
And you and I will be gone by then.
Not necessarily, but
dear.
No.
Is that close?
No. It could be far, but we might still yet see it. All right.